Hello and welcome to Axmine Media. My name is Melat Habtu and I'll be hosting Inside Tigray, a show that will give you a Tigrayan perspective on global, continental, and statewide affairs. Please tune in, listen, engage, and participate for an insightful and constructive discussion. Welcome to Axmine Media Network. We've got Duke Burbridge here with us today. Duke will be our guest in today's program. We'll be specifically speaking about the IDPs, the kind of conditions, the critical condition that they're in, some of the reports that we have seen coming out from different UN organizations, international aid organizations, speaking about aid distribution, in some cases, the lack of. And Duke will be giving his insight, his perspective on some of the recent reporting and some of the reasoning behind we may be seeing inadequacy in terms of dealing with the need when it comes to food aid. Thank you so much for joining us, Duke. Welcome to AMN. Welcome to Inside Tigray. I know it's your first time, but hopefully not your last. Maybe we can start off by introducing you, what you've been doing for the last 2 years, and just generally getting to know you. Tell us more about Duke.
Sure. For the past 2 years, I've been following the humanitarian situation pretty closely in Tigray. My interest from that came from a little bit before that when I had a research project in Ethiopia just prior to COVID coming out. So when COVID broke out, I was in Addis. I was in a hotel. I was waiting to do a second round of interviews with Ethiopian Muslim leaders about interreligious coexistence in Ethiopia, which is a pretty unique area of in that area. I've been looking at it in places like Pakistan, places like Yemen, other places where they have more challenges with Muslim-Christian harmony. In Ethiopia presented a little bit of a different picture. So I was excited to do that. Then the outbreak of COVID happened. I had to come back to Washington, D.C., and I was sitting waiting for my project to either continue or to be canceled. And of course, things hung around, and it never really hit Ethiopia the way it hit a lot of other places, certainly America. And so my project just sort of dragged on, and I wasn't focused on Tigray for my project because a lot of the issues that I was looking at took place a little bit further south. And so, but it had to be on my radar what was happening in Tigray. So as I saw sort of the descent into war and into this narrative that the government was promoting of, these are terrorists, these are horrible people. We need, they're trying to take over the country. And then some of the lies that were being told about the humanitarian assistance that people knew were false, but they were very strong narratives that were being pushed. I just looked at it and I thought, they're putting out incorrect information. And so I sort of tried to correct some of that information that was coming out. And that turned into pretty much the past 2 years of monitoring it very closely. And so that's what I've been doing pretty much.
Okay, great. I mean, you're the perfect person to speak about the what we have planned for today because I mean, we spoke beforehand as well, and I was telling you about some of my worries about the IDPs that have been currently displaced. And Axmine actually had the opportunity to go to some of the centers and interview these IDPs, the individuals, but also a coordinator that was an unofficial coordinator who was doing a lot of work when it comes to arranging suitable environmental conditions for the IDPs. I think we both kind of shared the concerns, some of our concerns, but it's also kind of very important that we kind of bring in the reports that we're seeing coming out of the international aid organizations, just to either collaborate and kind of see what the aid agencies are saying about food distribution, and maybe to kind of gauge an understanding of why the food distribution has slowed down. The first question that I have for you actually is about the recent report, last week's report, OCHA report, that clearly show that there has been a decrease in the last just less than a month of food distribution, and also the numbers that they have shown of the people being reached in terms of the people that need the aid and the people that have been reached is significantly lower. So I just wanted to see what your perspective is on that last report and why you may think that may be.
Yeah, it's the last report that came out from OCHA was it didn't cover precisely what's going on in Tigray right now. The World Food Program, the Food Cluster, puts out weekly food distribution reports that show a little bit more granularity in what's been happening. For the past couple of weeks, a couple of recorded weeks, they have not been distributing very much food at all. The last report that came out showed that only seriously about 52 people, 52, not 52,000, 52 people outside of the capital received food distribution. That is, of course, there's no way of quantifying how horrific that is. But this is maybe I think the second week that food distribution has been completely flat, almost no food distribution whatsoever. They are attributing it to difficulties with there may be some diversion of food aid going on that they're very concerned about. If food is not getting to the people who need it, there is not a lot that they can do with it, because they can't just keep pushing food out if they don't feel certain that it's getting to the people. So they had suspended their operations for a few weeks to try to get to the bottom of this, but it does not look like they have restarted yet, which is disappointing because I thought they would have by now. So it was paused for a while. Prior to that, there was a few weeks, maybe 4 weeks, 3 weeks of very strong food distribution, at least in the east, in the eastern zone, the central zone, in places anywhere that there wasn't a siege going on. Of course, in places like Europe, they're still not able to get food there. In northern areas of the central zone, they're close to the Eritrean border, they're not allowed to get food out there. The northwest zone was very tricky to get food into that. That's a whole different ball game as far as logistics go. It's very far away from the capital, so it takes a lot of gas to get from the capital to Shire and then come down throughout the northwest zone. They should ideally be able to get through Amhara to get food there, but that route was blocked off for a long time. They reopened it, but not really. So they've had a lot of logistical challenge. The World Food Program has been very much underperforming when it comes to getting food to people, particularly in the northwest zone. So there's been real challenges, and it looked for a while like they had beaten some of those challenges and they were getting food out, but then it just abruptly stopped. And they haven't put out anything. I mean, I read through the OCHA report. It doesn't mention that food isn't being distributed right now. In the World Food Program, they mention it, but not in OCHA. And that's a real problem with what's been going on with humanitarian assistance in Tigray, is that when things aren't going well, they don't necessarily mention it. Particularly after the cessation of hostilities, because this now becomes an issue of, is it going to make waves? Is it going to piss off the wrong people? That is more of a problem now than it was even before the peace process.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to go back to some of the things that you mentioned, what exactly do you mean by the diverting of food aid? What does that mean? What were those concerns?
It's vague right now. I was able to actually contact somebody in the World Food Program in Mekelle to talk about why we're not seeing food distribution, because they didn't give much of an explanation. The food diversion, they're talking about food diversion inside Tigray is all I know. They're not just talking about the Eritrean military looting warehouses, which that has been known to have been happening, particularly in the Northwest. They're not just talking about, the Amhara Fano, taking trucks or blocking trucks. This appears to be happening within Tigray. I don't know the specifics of who they believe is doing it or who's being accused of doing it, but it is happening in Tigray, according to the World Food Program, allegedly. I don't think they've actually come to any definite conclusions, but that's the information that I have.
Okay, so interesting. So I guess that would fall under the jurisdiction of the interim regional administration to be able to ensure that they are facilitating the correct, the processes of aid distribution to make sure it's getting to the right people. So there has to be a level of accountability, I think, outside of just the food agencies with the interim regional administration. Because I mean, that is what Pretoria is about, isn't it? To make sure that a deal that actually benefits people being able to have access to food distribution. So yes, that's definitely a massive concern. And I hope that does get resolved quite soon, because as you said, like, people are very, the halting of food distribution for the last 2 weeks can have a very detrimental effect. So it's definitely something that needs to be dealt with. Speaking of the food distribution and issues around that, there was a report that we had discussed, you and I, in the last couple of days, that you kind of mentioned to me a bit of the kind of gray kind of areas of why that report was deleted. It was a UNHCR report. So just tell us more about who conducted the report, firstly, and what kind of methods that were used to conduct the report.
Well, it was a UN report. They did not release who exactly actually performed the focus groups or went to made these site visits. The methodology that they used was excellent for what they're looking for, which is how human beings are being affected by the deprivation, by the conditions on the ground. Normally, the reports that we've been seeing coming out of Tigray have been to demonstrate the performance of the UN or the World Food Program or some of the groups that are working there, to show that they're doing a good job. It's more of an advertisement than actually looking at it from a human perspective. How people, they'll say, we distributed 10,000 food rations. That sounds like a lot of food rations, unless you know that there are 120,000 people who needed food rations. Then it sounds like very little. And so this report that they put out, it was very short. It was less than 10 pages. It covered a number of cities in the eastern zone, around Hausen and in that area, not too far up north, but it covered some of the areas that you had real question marks. Are people getting food? And it showed that they were not getting food, that they didn't have enough food, that they didn't have enough medicine, that they were having to walk to places like to try to get medical services. Pregnant women were having to walk. And it showed that life was very, very difficult for people who were coming. And these were people who were returning from being displaced. They were displaced to places like Mekelle, but because they were not able to get food, because food wasn't being distributed there, many of them went home. A couple of them, it was facilitated by the UN hosts there, that they were given. They're given out a sack of food, enough to keep them for a little while, and they're brought back to the places that they were living. But most of them actually individually left the displacement centers because they had no food, they had no medicine. They were afraid they wouldn't be able to survive, so they came back. Unfortunately, they came back to find most of the same situations, and to find that all that they had to farm the land, or some of them were, herders, or all of that was destroyed or stolen or looted by the Eritrean military. So they came back to nothing. And that report was on the website for a few days. It got downloaded. It got talked about. There were a couple of media articles about it. And then they took it off the website. And the closest thing I could get to a reason why it was taken off was because it was not authorized for release, which is it's a very incomplete answer. They didn't challenge the findings of it. Nobody came out and said this was made up, or this was incorrect, or the methodology was wrong. They just said, well, the person, however it was released, however it was uploaded to the site, which I can't imagine that was done without anybody knowing about it, but however it was uploaded to the site, it wasn't authorized for that information to get out. And that's been what we've seen with displaced people and the conditions that they've lived in, that they're living in now, and that they've been living in for the past several months. This is unfortunately some kind of secret, it seems like, from the UN, that they will not give any indication of this is what a human being, this is what a family is experiencing. That type of information does not get out. And that is a real problem, because you want to be able to assume that they know where the displaced families are, that they know where to get the food to and the medicine to and the shelters to, but you can't really assume that after what we've seen for the past 2 years of displaced families having nothing, being forced to survive on begging, the local community who's also suffering, not being able to get food from the major organizations, implementing organizations that are distributing food. It's been very, very challenging. So there's I wish I could say that there were some loud calls for transparency, but it doesn't seem to be progressing very much, and that's a real shame, and that's a danger to the health of the people who are displaced.
Yeah, I think it's very important to kind of focus on the fact that it was removed from the website, because if it hadn't been for you, I would not have known about that report. It was when you sent it to me that I actually, I was really surprised actually, and I looked over the report and I said, I've never seen, like, I did not have a chance to view the report because it was taken down a couple of days later, right? So I think it's very important that people actually pointed towards the report to be able to actually go and see with some of the information that is on it. I can briefly kind of speak about it here. So some of the towns that you mentioned, one of them all around the area of Adigrat, either north or west of Adigrat, or some south of Adigrat, Hausen being a complete different, a bit further away. But the 3 towns that were specifically mentioned were around Adigrat, so quite close to the Eritrean border. One of them that was actually quite shocking to me was Kokop Sabah, which is north of Adigrat. And what they mentioned in the report was it was just under the inhabitants of the town was under 2,000, just around just under 2,000 households. We're talking about over 10,000 individuals that lived in the town. All of them had been displaced during the war. So a whole town had been destroyed. It was an Eritrean military base during the time. And now that a lot of them had been returning, only 88 of nearly 2,000 households have been receiving assistance. And I mean, this is shocking considering that they've lost all their livestock, they've lost all their personal properties. There is no functioning health services, no functioning schools, markets, administration, nothing like that. And then you come to Hadinet, which is, I think, quite close to Idaga Hamus, west of Adigrat. And there it says that there was this was the process, I think, done by the international organizations to return the IDPs, and around just under 300 households had returned, and they had not received any aid since last year, since 2022. Right. And then we go on to Fatsi, which is north of Adigrat, and these families, some of them, the women had effectively returned, I think, to the towns, but their husbands, due to Eritrean presence in the towns, have had to stay in Adigrat for security measures. And again, the women do not feel safe in actually coming out during the day and stuff like that. So there's a vast security concern as well. But because they were not receiving adequate aid around Adigrat, they've had to return. The same thing with housing. A lot of the IDPs were in Makala, but again, they had not been receiving adequate aid, and they had returned to housing. There, I think there is a lot of, especially in a specific town, I can't quite remember what the name is. There's a lot of sexual gender-based violence survivors. And there is some assistance for them, but in terms of food assistance, again, that's quite inadequate. So you mentioned that the methods used to conduct this research in itself is something that you feel, from your perspective, is quite solid and sound, right? So do you think there is a political concern maybe that these kind of research point to the not just the inadequacy of aid, but also the fact that, first of all, the very strong Eritrean presence, the lack of security for IDPs, the lack of ability of the administration to influence some of the conditions for the IDPs. What do you think the political context is to not publishing reports such as this?
Yeah, I think that all of those are considerations. I mean, there was one town in the report that the town is just several kilometers from the border with Eritrea, but they were saying that, you know, less than a few miles from the town center, there was still presence of Eritrean forces. Now that would have been a violation of the cessation of hostilities agreement. That is an indication that the African Union is not doing anything to monitor Eritrean troop presence in Tigray, which is what they're supposed to be doing. And in reality, that's what the entire world, the United States, the EU, anybody who is involved in the peace process, is all of them, their eyes and ears in Tigray are supposed to be this AU monitoring system. If that's not working out, if they're not really looking at whether or not there are Eritrean soldiers in Tigray, if Tigray is still being invaded, occupied by Eritrean soldiers, which we all know that it is, that shows that they're not doing their job, and that system of monitoring what's going on in Tigray is a farce. I mean, that's what that demonstrates. Now, also, it's very, you know, it paints the World Food Program in a bad light to see that these people who were in Mekelle, they got to the capital. This would have been the best place to displace to actually find yourself, because people were being displaced to places like Shiraro and in Shire, where food just wasn't getting there. But Mekelle is sort of the launch pad for humanitarian assistance in Tigray. If they can get it to Mekelle, then hopefully they can get it elsewhere. And so there were warehouses full of food during the time that these families, these households, were not receiving anything. And so that paints them in a bad light. It shows that there had been rumors that the system that they were using for distributing food in Mekelle was not counting the IDP population that had come there, and that would sort of verify those the rumors. It also, of course, the stories of sexual violence, which they highlighted it in one town, but it didn't mean that was just happening in that town. There were instances throughout Tigray of this. Those are crimes against humanity being committed by the Eritrean military. So that, then the report becomes evidence of crimes against humanity, potentially evidence of genocide, because it suggests a pattern. When you talk about that town that was completely displaced, it shows the sort of the modus operandi of the Eritrean military, which is, I don't think a lot of supply trucks came into Tigray to feed the Eritrean military. They lived off of the crops in Tigray, or whatever they could loot, or whatever they could steal from either warehouses or private residences or off the fields themselves. And so there were a number of implications from that report that were very uncomfortable implications with the narrative that we're supposed to be following after Pretoria, that this is the guns have been silenced, and that's a big deal. It's not so important if the guns are silenced, if people can't eat, if people are being sexually assaulted, if people are being killed, then you see that a lot of that falls apart. So there were a number of reasons why this was a bad report for the UN. This was a bad report for the Ethiopian government, who had been blocking aid. This was a bad report for the Eritrean military, who had been doing disturbing things in Tigray and for some of the other organizations. But these are the things that aren't supposed to bend. You're not supposed to, suppress information coming out. Those are the sort of the checks and balances of how we know that we need to, distribute more food or raise more money or, fix the logistics to get there. If you suppress that information, that's something that doesn't usually happen when it comes to a humanitarian response like that. And it's happening in Tigray. It's been happening for 2 years, where they've been very careful with the information that gets out. And it's very sad.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you kind of touched on it, but crimes against humanity, the fact that this continues to take place after Pretoria is very much, it's very concerning, very alarming, but is also, I think, a very strong political statement. The fact that Pretoria is not being implemented in the manner that we're receiving in some of the avenues of narratives that we're receiving from so many different places. And it kind of shows that there is a very strong narrative coming from all sides, even from the government, from the interim regional administration, from the government in Addis Ababa, from the international community, saying that there are now tangible steps being taken in Pretoria, after Pretoria, to ensure that IDPs will be returned, that the security apparatus is restored in Tigray. But it kind of speaks about some of these things in the past tense, rather than these things actually happening right now in the present tense. Like these things are currently happening, but they're still being talked about as if they had happened, and now we're taking a step forward to resolve some of the issues, which is very concerning. Again, it kind of ties into some of the reports that we just discussed with when it comes to aid agencies as well. But the conditions in which these IDPs are also being displaced in is quite important to note as well. And I think when these reports are being cited, there has to be contextual information about how the IDPs left and what kind of conditions they left. And I think that it somehow ties into the political aspect of Pretoria and to make sure that some of the concerns about making sure that Pretoria is sustainable. So speaking about these things, that the conditions in which IDPs are being displaced in, we have managed to, as I shared with you before, we have managed to conduct some interviews with IDPs, most of them who have been displaced for the second time after being displaced from Western Tigray, from places around Humara. They've been displaced for the second time and are now in Ndabaguna, which is a town quite close to Shire. And it, the interview, I think I showed you beforehand, but it will be great if I can play it now, and we can kind of reflect on it. And I know that you kind of had some things to say about the number of the increase of the IDPs that have been arriving in Ndabaguna. So we can reflect on the conditions that they have left behind, but also the conditions that need to be met for them to be able to exist in a dignified manner in Ndabaguna. So I will play the video for us now.
ንባዕሉ ወጊሑ ንባዕሉ ዝመሲ ኩሉ ዝጎደሎ ኣይ ክርሲ ኣይ ነብሲ ናብራ ኮይና እዚኣ ጸላእቲ ኣቕኒኣ
ሕራ ሓወይ ሽምካ መን ክብል መን ሽምካ?
ሽመይ ፍስሓ ይበሃል።
ፍስሓ
ገርመስቀል።
ሕራ ካበይ ኢኻ መፂኻ ሕዚ እንዳባጉና?
ሕጂ ዝመፃኽዎ ከማይ ፀብሪ እየ።
ከማይ ፀብሪ መፂኻ? ቀደም ኣበይ ትነብር ነርካ?
ምዕራብ ነብር ነይረ ኣነ ወልቃይት ዝበሃል ቦታ። ወልቃይት መፂ
ካብ ወልቃይት
ወልቃይት
ንማይ ፀብሪ መፂኻ ማለት? ኦኬ። እንደይ ተቐሚጥካ ኣብዚኣ ማይ ፀብሪ?
እኔ
كلت عمت اوكي انت اي قتي ما يصبر السين سخانا ما يصبرنا يزوم حزن دابوغنا مسيم زلو تاعي حلفنا زلك ابزو حزي انت اي تحجز زوم تفناقل تبزي
يو نجم ما يصبر تفناقل الموت متحاذر يميا
هو
متحاذر يم لو متينا وزي نوزي متينا من هنا زرو متينا متحاذر فيني متحاذر فيني ترخو نجر يلا ترخو نجر يلا تفناقل بتاع سلم
عندي زوم تفناقل لسك حزب بقطر اني كارو نجرنا تفلو بقطري تفناقلي
بقطر نيني نيناي قال لا تفناقل المزنيا كما يصوري يو قال لا مالتي كاري 25 شح نيناي 25 شح يزون نيناي ما يصوري لو وردا سلمت زمتا 25 شح علمنا
خمين يرتفونات كاب ما يصبر خمي من يبارلكم تايم زول نيرا مخنياتو
محرق كاتو دلو تجروا يبهال كاين ركب نحار دينا بعلت
هو
بتكمتي علت حمشته كنحردينا خنودينا إلهم يومنا جرحات يمو تسوقنا يترفن حريدي
هو
كم عدو سنة يبهال كابي سران حمشتن سوت حريدي بخارا مالك
أبي زي
عدو سنة
زبال
عدو سنة هو ما يصير كويس
هو
بتروسي إلها
هو بمتى محرر مو بخارا فانو جم
فانو اليامارا مالك
هو
مزيم عدو سنة يبهال سران حمشتن يخونو حريدم كايتو أوروهم ناتهالوكن أو يتقوريهم تاريخا تسبر جيجوت أفيو
كاليخا كاب محارج وطايب خالي زموتو
بقى خالي زموتو بتيجي رخو كايم أوتالي فوضو مشلا فوضو نداشمو سميتي سترفو يلن مالك تعامي سب تقروا ايها قالسك اها ناتبهاله دليك يبهال اتو يبهال بتعامل سب تبساويسي يقول هذا خابي ناي حدا اسر بيت يوسدوا اسر بيت وسوسودو نغوندر نصانو انا كو عيني درع يكون لعلي 10 ماكينه تصعينكم زخور 15 ماكينه كاب اسر بيت ناوصو معلتي 15 ماكينه وسيدني الساتم قل دهاي سبلو معنتي يلو سبلو معنتي 15 ماكينه زبال دهاي ميلو يلا من يسات راي خيد ولا نستيتي من يسات وتعطي منس مجيم دهاي مليون ساحج حجي يقولوا قتل لي زلهم كافتناي ناي بوليس مأسري سو قديفم نغياتي مو ددويت بانك نيرو افتناي ددويت مأسري مودل
ددويت عقان القحن
هو او مأسري غير مودل او ما اسوي ياسروا او صرغي اوصيم او عداغا بيتسب يمص 50 شح خفل 100 شح خفل تزي خيفيلكا سو كايترخون يبال زلو يخفل زيول يسعن ወይ ድማ ናፍታ መርሸም ብጣዕሚ እዩ ዝኸፈ ዝገነነ ይጀምየ ማለት
ሕራይ ሕዚ ኣብ ወርቂ እውን ንዓለኒ ኳዕቲ ወርቂ እውን ማሕበረሰብ ታዘላ ዝሓሸት ትበሃል ናይ ኢኮኖሚ ትርከበላ ሳ ስለ ዝኾነት ናብ ወርቂ ከም ዝወፍር መናእሰይ ኩሉ ህዝቢ እውን ነጊሮም ነይሮሞ ኣብኡ እንታይ እዩ ዝገፅም ኣብቲ ወርቂ
توكلي أو ورقي توكلني ورقي ناي ملسا ورقي محضر نيرو ورقي محضر نيرو ناو بصور ودنا ورقنيا ويسرحوا يغنى بتقامه حزمهم كيدم او غحفهم وسيدم يوسد وسيدم يقتل برها قاتلا ورقي خطيرم كلتشا سلستشا دبا سمي لي بهال او قسرات بهال زي ناي ورق بوتا أبني تكز كاري مالك أوزي بزح حساب بموت الله فوق البرخان بزح حساب دما تأثر له وركني هاي مالك أب هاي داقول ሃይዳት በኋላ ፍላይ ቦታ አውሪ ደግሞ سران حمشين كابين قتيلهم سمكون يتقورون تقبر يمين ويتقورون بيتسبع يقورون كاو أنت جنتا نتهالة ذاك علسة لا تسحب لا تأثر أو سقاين أم مكران يجلو سوقون خم تريقوا بقى يقور في جنيه يقور في جنيه عادة رأيك
እንስሳውን ተወሲደን ዝብለሎ እንታይ እንስሳ ተወሲደን እየን ትገዛውን ካብ ደባርቕ ናምፁ ኣምሓሪስ ዝብለሎ ገለ ይበሃል ኣሎ ሞ ከመይ እዩ ኩነታት
በቃ ገንዘብ በቃ ሙሳድ ይኸል ገንዘብ የስራ ያለዋ 30 ያለዋ 50 ያለዋ ብጣዕሚ ገንዘብ የለን ወሲዶም ናይ ትግራይ አይና እጅንታ ናታሃል ከይደን የለን ማለት እዩ እጅና ያለ አና ወልቀይት አለ ደንበም ለእግሪፌን ወሲዶም ወልቀት ተወሲዶም እኽሊ ከም ዘለዎ ወሲዶም ጤል ከም ዘለዎ በደንብን የምስዶም ማለት ጥራይ ናተ ዘይኮነስ ሙሉእ ብሙሉእ ተወረዳ ማለት ተፈናቂሉ ዝመፀ ገንዘብ ያምፀ ክዳን ያምፀ እዚያ ገርሰና ነይሩ ሕጂ ዘንጋዕና ነገር ንእምበር ብጣዕሚ ተሳዊ
ካብ ናይ ደባርቕ ካብ ደባርቕ ህዝብና ኣምፁ እቲ ካብ ማይ ፀብሪ ዘሎ ትግራዋይና ባረሩ የስፍርሎ ገለ ዝበሃል ኸ እንታይ ትዕዝብቲ እኒአ ካብኡ
ትክክለኛ እዩ ትግራዋይ ውፃእና ተባሃለ ጤና እምነት ናይ ዞም ማዓስከር ነይሩ ኣብኡ ኣቲ ነይሩ ተፈናቃሊ ዝበሃል ኣብኡ ኣቲ ነይሩ ገዛ ዛካረይኻ ንጁንታ ትግራዋይ ዛካረይኻ ንዓልኻ ይትበል ኣንታ ወዲ ዓዲ ትበሃል ተፈናቃለ ማለት እዩ ንዓልኻ ይትበል ኣብዚኣ ኣምሓር ኣለዉ ደባርቕ ካብ ጎንደር እዚኦም ከኣትዎ እዮም ኣውፅልና ቀልጢፎም ይኸይዱ እርዳታ ይረኹ ኣይብሉ ኣጥፍኡልና እዚኦም ካብዛ መዓልቲ እዚኣ እንተዘይወፅኹሞም ንዓኹም ግን ሓቢርና ነበረኹ ዝበሃል ኣምሓር መፅኦም ኣትዮ እሞ ናይ ትግራዋይ ገንዘብ ናይ ትግራዋይ ገዛ ብዓለም የምሰሕሉ ብዓለም የምሰሕሉ ንብረት ዝበሃል የለን ተጓሕጒሑ ናይቲ ገዛ ውቲ ሕጂ ሚሩ ነበረ ተንዲነታት ናቆረፁ ፅዒኖም ይፅዓን እዩ ዘኒአ ሕጂ ግን ሓፂን ይኹን ናይ ቤት ትምህርቲ ይኹን ወሲዶም ፅዒኖም ንብረት ይበሃል የለን ቁራል የዶ ግዛዕ ናበሉ ወሲዶም መጢጥ
ሕዚ ካብ ማይ ፀብሪ ተፈናቂሉ ዝመፀ ህዝብና እንታይ ዓይነት ፀገማት ይበፅሐሎ እዚ ሓመይ ኢሉ ይናበር ኣሎ እዚ ኣብ እንዳባጉና ኣብዚ ዝመፀ
በቃ መናእሰይታ ምልመን እያ ገዛ ገዛ ከባቢ ደባጉና እሱ እዩ ቁራስ እንጀራ እዩ ዝህብ እምበር ዝመፅእ ስርናይ የለን ዝመፅእ እርዳታ ነገር የለን ሰብ ግን ናፍታ ወርቂ ከይኸይድ ከምታ ዝብልክኩም ዓንተዋያ ኣብኣ ፀኒሖም ዝኣሪቦ ኣብዚኣ በቃ ናይ ከባቢ ደባጉና ገጠር ይኹን ከተማ ይኹን ናልመን እዩ ዘሎ ናልመን ተረፍ ናይ ተወዲ ዓዲ ሳይ ዝቆርስ رغم أنهم كانوا مثلاً خارج شو مسألة نارا عبد الجيدر كان نتوقع يعني أما على حنت جزئية ورس مالك تاريخ من عليهم دكتور سانيها أولي أنيها بتمثل وضع أنيها مالك أفتي خارج جبز اللواء عيد بنا وضع أنيها بتمثل وضع أنيها
نايز كتما من محدار زفون حاجة زي قبل لكم يمثل يريكم له
يرينا هو ريناي كم رأي ريناي من غيرنا يمنا مزجب يزني أمبر مزجب أيود دان يمسد حدا يمزجبنا ورقة حزي خير يمزجب ورقة حزي خير ساوز يقول نسحنا هنا مزجو يمزجو مزجبون بعدين أي مدرسة أي مدرسة فكذا حتى معتي فأنا جريكانات مثل الله جريكان من تايل جريكانس أخلي زيه ولين جريكان تايم قرن أخلي زيه ولين جريكان تايم قرن طبعاً نام قدامي يمكن أخلي مثل ما أنقلي قولعت قولني ما أنقلي أرجوان قولنا نامير أرجوان تخم تريوه ودي أمم دلوا تساوي من دلوا
هذا حكمنا قالوا تيلن نزحمه موضع حكمنا قالوا
حكمنا بزخلت معاتي جمرنا حكمنا تخليه بزخلت معاتي نتاعنا جمرنا أتى بالقلة يا بزخلته حكمنا جمرنا
በብመዓልቲ ካብ ማይ ፀብሪ ክንደይ ሰብ ይመፅእ መዓስ ከዓ ሕዚ እውን ይቕፅል ለይተዋሕዝ ኢልካ እሞ በብመዓልቲ ክንደይ ሰብ ይመፅእ?
በቃ ኣብ መዓልቲ ኣተው እንተተባሂሉ 150 ልዕሊ 150 ዝኣተ ኣሎ ከባቢ እኒአ ለማዓንቲ ኮ ለማዓንቲ ተኾነ ሪኢኹሞም እንትኾኑ ኣድጎም ፅዒኖም ናብ ከባቢ 23 እዮም ካብ ብዓይኒ ዝረኣይኽዎም ሕጂ ኣብቲ IDP ነይረ ኣነ ንባዕለይ 23 ኣድጊ ብሰቦም ፅዒኖም ኣትዮም
ኣበይ ሰፍሩ እቶም ሓደሽቲ ዝመፁ ኣበይ ሰፍሩ እስኪ?
ዝኽእል ካብታ ብራንዳ
ኣብ ባይታ ማለት እዩ።
ኣብ ባይታ ካሊእ ማልእ የላ ፅላል የብላ ቀትሪ ኣብ ፅላል ደገ ወፂኻ ትውዕል ምሸት ኣብታ IDP ትኣቱ።
እስኪ ምናልባት ኣብኡ እንዳሃለኻ ሓገዝ ኣብ ደገ ዝነብሩ ተጋሩ ክኾን ይኽእል እዮም ወይ ዝምልከቶ ዝኾነ ይኹን መንግስታዊ ኣካል እውን ክኾን ይኽእል እዩ ናይ ማይ ፀብሪ ዘሎ ተፈናቃሊ ወኪል ኢኻ ዘለኻ እሞ ተሕልፎ መልእኽቲ ወይ ተድሊካ?
ዝሮ ዝሮ ኣነ ዘመሓልፎ ማለት እዩ ንህዝቢ ትግራይ ንዝተፈናቀሉ ዝመፅእ ዘሎ ኣነስ ብጣዕሚ ዝብለ እዩ 50 ቅርሺ ይኹን 100 ቅርሺ ይኹን ንኽእልእ ክልና እቶም ሓሚሞም ዘለዉ እቶም ደኺሞም ዘለዉ እዚኣ ንኽእልእ ክልና የተሓባብር ማለት እዩ።
የቐኒልና ሓራይ ዝሓዊ
ንባዕሉ ወጊሑ ንባዕሉ ዝመሲ ኩሉ ዝጎደሎ ኣይክርሲ ኣይነብሲ ናብራ ኮይና እዚኣ ጸላእቲ ኣቕኒኣ ሓዲኡ ክበልዕ ሓዲኡ ክነብር ዓዲ ተባሪዓ ኣይ ኣይ ቀቲሉ ዝሕጎስ ዘሪፉ ዝሽለም ርህራሄ ዘይብላ ናይ ጨካናት ዓለም ዘይዛዕርኽ ርእንቲ ዘይወግሕ ለይቲ መመሊሱ ይኸብድ መዓልቲ መዓልቲ ውይ
That was the interview that we managed to do with Fesseha. Fesseha is, like I mentioned, the unofficial coordinator of the IDPs that have arrived from Mais Abri, 25,000 who have been displaced from Tsalamti, the area around Mais Abri, to Ndabaguna. You know, like we spoke about earlier in the report that came out last week by OCHA, it was, I think the numbers have increased from 37,200 from 37,200 to 45,400, just short of 10,000. So I think that's a massive increase, even the number that we're getting from OCHA itself, that shows that there's a massive increase. And as we heard just now, and with other various interviews that we managed to conduct with other IDPs who are also in the same area, one of the main reasons of them being displaced again, these people are, again, like I mentioned earlier, just being displaced for the second time round, being displaced again, is because of the Amhara forces who are effectively moving in new settlers from northern Gondar and Debark and moving them into the homes of these Tigrayans who had resided in Mais Abri. The landlords are being told not to rent to Tigrayans, ethnic Tigrayans. And if they do rent to ethnic Tigrayans, they too will be targeted. So it's not like they have a choice. And these IDPs are forced out, systematically forced out, but also forced out, as he mentioned earlier, through killings, through forcible disappearances. They don't know what's happened to some of their loved ones, and some of their loved ones who have been killed, they're not even allowed to bury. This is something that we had, I'm sure, Duke, this is fresh in your mind, from some of the reporting by Amnesty and Human Rights Watch when they spoke about ethnic cleansing in Western Tigray. So these are the people, the survivors of that ethnic cleansing, who've managed to make it to Mais Abri and Tsalamti and are now being, again, ethnically cleansed out of the areas they had, that had hosted them for the last 2 years. The conditions are honestly really horrendous. But again, we come back to the point that there is somehow a change in narrative about what Pretoria is achieving and which direction is heading in, that ignores these IDPs, that ignores the conditions that still exist for these IDPs. Because yes, we can speak about their aid agencies and the adequacy of their food distribution, but what about the conditions of why these IDPs are in themselves being displaced in the first place? So I just want to get your reflection on what we just watched. I know I sent it to you a couple of days earlier, and just what you have gauged from the interview. Is there any comments that you would like to make about it?
Yeah, this is what we're seeing here is, once again, in Tigray, is everything we were afraid that was happening, but we didn't know for sure. We get confirmation that it did happen, that it is happening right now. When you looked at right after Pretoria, they were able to get a couple of trucks in of food aid 2 or 3 weeks after Pretoria was, after the cessation of hostilities was signed, and it went right into the maybe 10, 15, 20 kilometers into Tigray, into the southern area of the southern zone, and into the southern area of the northwest zone. And there was a real fear when you saw that pattern, that it almost seemed like they were only allowing food into places that were areas that were targeted for annexation by the Amhara regional government. And of course, the implication there is that the people who lived in those places would be ethnically cleansed, would be either killed or forced to move. And that, if you looking at that video and the good work you guys did to document that, shows why the UN might be unwilling to let reports go out that actually speak to the people on the ground, that present their perspective. Because in that interview produced significant eyewitness testimony of ethnic cleansing, of crimes against humanity. That makes the whole peace process a little bit more sinister than all of the celebrations that are happening. They begin celebrating this a long time before it happens, and they're still celebrating it. And you can see that what they're celebrating in many cases are horrible things. Even the specific of not being able to bury the dead, as you mentioned, that this was discussed by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch in Western Tigray. It makes me think of Europe. There was a documented in displacement camps. I believe the displacement camp was in Edgarat or around there, where they had been displaced. This was the same thing. They were not even allowed to bury the dead. And this was something that was brought up by everyone who talked about it, as this was such a devastating thing. And as a parent myself, I can't imagine. I can't imagine this happening. I can't imagine not being able to bury my children or my family. Nobody can. And so you get to the heart of what is happening. The reality on the ground for so many people is devastating. And these are stories that interfere with all of the celebrations around. With there was an award given to the EU special envoy a couple of days ago for her role in this. And yeah, this is there are horrible things still happening, and this is what we were afraid of. And then this sort of confirms it. It's a devastating interview. I'm so glad you guys were able to capture the testimony, because there is a effort to silence the voices of Tigray. Even now, even after Pretoria, they were silenced for 2 years, and now they're still being silenced. And so it's a very good job on you guys to actually be able to document that.
Yeah, thank you. So I think, what do you recommend? What do you recommend that those people who have been involved in advocacy for the last 2 years, a lot of the diaspora efforts, and even like international organizations that have been making sure that the human rights abuses and the ethnic cleansing and the crimes against humanity in Tigray were exposed. What do you recommend that, moving forward, how should they conduct some of how should they conduct the release of some of their findings in a way that does not kind of damage the steps being taken to create peace amongst different actors, but also in a way that doesn't completely gaslight and hide the real life experiences, the current experiences, and the trauma and the anguish that these IDPs are facing currently in the present, like today. So what is the fine line and how do we maneuver that? Just from as a recommendation from you.
From my perspective, I worked in a number of conflict areas prior to Ethiopia. When I came to Ethiopia, it wasn't so much of a conflict area, but in places like Yemen, in places like Afghanistan, in Syria, where information can have it could be a double-edged sword. It could hurt the people that are there as much as expose their suffering to be. It is challenging. To know what to release and what to not release. But in this case, in the case of Tigray, it seems that every decision has been made to silence the voices of the people. They need to, instead of looking to see, whether or not is this a good idea to put out, they need to look and see, do we have the right to silence these voices? Is it our role? Is it the role of the World Food Program to not say exactly why food has been stopped? Is it the role of the UN to not talk about the actual conditions that people are living in these displacement camps? About a year ago, there was a report about the people who were displaced during the first occupation of Tigray, and looking at the conditions they lived in. It was one of the deepest reports that you could find in terms of actually finding out what conditions people were living in, what type of services, supplies, food were available to the people. And it was horrific. It showed that food was not getting to people. Medical services were not getting to people. They didn't have shelter. As the gentleman in the video was talking about, people living outside. In this report from a year ago, I can recall, in that same location that he's in right now, the 2 out of the 3 displacement camps, there were people living outside, people sleeping underneath the stars. This is absolutely incompatible with anybody's obligation to humanitarian assistance, actually providing food and services and shelter for these guys. And it has to get out. These things have to get out. If this was a different situation, I could see being very careful about what you release and what you don't release. But in Tigray, where you have had a complete shutdown of information getting out, where they have made it illegal to bring in satellite phones or illegal to document some of these things and to bring information out of Tigray, you have to err on the side of transparency. And that's something that the UN has not done. That's something that even the organizations like that specifically focus on things like displacement, they haven't been transparent. There needs to be transparency. Whoever's making the decision either to self-censor or if they're being told to censor, you have to look at whether or not that is your role, whether or not you have the right to stifle this information from coming out, because I think you'll find that you don't have that authority. And so I would love to see people put a lot more pressure on the UN specifically to get information out there, to actually do the types of studies that were done in the report that they took down, where they're actually visiting these places, talking to people in a focus group, instead of just sitting in the capital, in Addis Ababa or even in Mekelle, and saying, here's the number of food, the tons of food that we sent out there, so they're fine. You don't know that, and particularly with people who've been displaced, who come with nothing, come with a donkey, or come with maybe a sack of food on their back, and that's it. Whatever they can carry, that's not going to last them. They need to look at this from the perspective of the people who are suffering, instead of from the perspective of the organization that's trying to provide. Everybody wants to look good. I understand that people want to have, I don't want to call it advertisement, but they want to show that they're doing something, that they're actually taking action to try to get food to people. But you have to show the situation that the people were in. You said you have to show the context, and if you can't show the context, to say that 75,000 rations were distributed can be used for disinformation very easily, because that sounds like a big number. It's not a big number if there are 5.3 million people who need food. Then it's a very small number. So you have to be able to present that with the context. They're self-censoring themselves away from that, and that has to stop. It has to stop.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it's all our responsibilities to do our due diligence, to actually look into these reports, and to be able to share them within the community and even outside of the community, to point to some of the horrific conditions that these people are in. Because without us even having the knowledge, just as you shared that report with me, which I had no knowledge of, for example, it could really make a difference in a lot of these IDPs' lives and the conditions that they currently are in. Thank you so much, Duke. That will be the end of our discussion today. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you for taking the time out. Hopefully we can have you more, hear more to, sometimes as we go through some of these reports, we would definitely appreciate your perspective. So thank you again for joining us. We appreciate you. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. And just real quick, that report is still available on Tigray Media. So you could still find the report if you look hard enough for it.
And we will definitely add the link to the report to make sure people who are viewing this interview would be able to have access to it. So that's definitely something we'll do. Thank you, Duke.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Inside Tigray. We will be back next time with more topics and more guests.